All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming. If you're just joining us now, welcome. And if you're still with us, I hope you're feeling fresh as we go into the afternoon section of today's events. Next up, we're joined by James T. Morgan, the attorney with the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Criminal Enforcement, Forensics and Training's Legal Counsel Division. JT has been with the EPA almost 25 years and has led complex Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and Safe Drinking Water Act litigation throughout his tenure. He also advises on criminal environmental referrals to the Department of Justice. He has a master's in environmental sciences and earned his JD from California Western School of Law and was my first boss in Washington, D.C. Beyond being an incredible role model, he's one of the smartest legal minds I know. So I hope you guys enjoy his presentation. Today, we'll be focusing on a case that they brought as it relates to the RIN, renewable energy fuel market. And I think that's all from me. JT, take it away.
Thank you, Daniel, and I will give you the gratuity afterwards. Anyway, obviously, I'm JT Morgan from EPA, and let me give you a brief overview, sort of who we are at EPA in the Criminal Enforcement Office. We can go to the next slide. And so, let me take a couple. Anyway, so you can see up there, you know, about 275 professionals. These are scientists, attorneys, investigators, et cetera. The special agents, these are badge-carrying, gun-carrying federal agents. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. We have about 80 personnel at what's called the National Enforcement Investigation Center, the NEIC in Denver. And these are the CSI guys, I'm sorry, for EPA. They are the investigators who can go to a scene of a pollution incident. They can fingerprint chemicals. They can identify things, you know, scientifically and forensically that will then obviously be evidence at a prosecution. And they're an incredibly talented group of scientists and engineers. And we have approximately 36 attorneys scattered around the country who are dedicated solely to environmental crimes enforcement. I mean, there's more, but you know, they have other roles, but basically, you know, that's the team at EPA. We can go to the next slide. And so we have to actually establish partnerships because there really is no shortage of criminal wrongdoing in the environmental field. And so we work with federal partners. You can see some of the ones up there. Obviously, Department of Justice is one of our primary organizations we work with, but we work with state, tribal, local officials to investigate and prosecute environmental crimes. We obviously work with other federal agencies. We have international contacts. We have an agent posted to Interpol so that we can chase down folks who may have fled the country or, you know, or have fled some other jurisdiction and come to the US. And I'll talk about that in the case example. And obviously we work with, you know, people like the FBI, the IRS, and those kind of entities. But what we're doing here is we're leveraging, because, you know, we have limited resources, they have limited resources, but when we come onto something that merits, you know, federal investigation and prosecution, then we need these partners. So, and basically, real quick, the CID, the Criminal Investigation Division, these are our special agents. I said they carry guns, have badges. Interestingly, EPA federal agents are authorized to enforce for any violation of federal law. They have one of the most broad mandates of any federal investigative agency. So we're one of the few agencies that, you know, for example, if an EPA agent saw some drug deal going down on the street, they are legally authorized to intervene. Now, we don't want that to happen. We want them to focus our limited resources on environmental crime, but they have a very broad mandate from Congress. And we can go to the next slide. So these are the primary statutes you're seeing here. And so if there's going to be an investigation, typically, or prosecution following an investigation, it's going to intersect with one of these statutes for the most part. You know, there may be rare instances where there's something else, but typically this is what we do. These are the statutes we enforce. And let's go to the next slide. And this is kind of a real quick overview of where we are recently as of 2022. So you can see that air violations make up almost 40% of our docket. Water, about what, 25%. Now, FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, it's a mouthful, but this is, there's been a huge uptick in FIFRA because During the COVID crisis, all kinds of fraudsters began selling various items that they say this will prevent you from getting COVID. It'll clean surfaces. It'll, purify the air. Well, COVID is they're selling it as an insecticide. And the fraud that was being committed here was clever. Sometimes they would simply steal somebody else's registration number, put it on their product, and put it on the internet. That's fraud. It's a big no-no. Sometimes they just make a number up, stick it on their product, and set it up on the internet. Again, a big no-no, because you have to prove to EPA that the product you're selling is efficacious, safe, et cetera. So we had a huge uptick in FIFRA. The uptick in air enforcement, just kind of a note, is so remember the VW case where they falsified the software to make it look like their cars were, so it wasn't limited to VW, actually. It was, Chrysler Fiat did it. I think Mercedes did it. And we have what we call these aftermarket companies that some guy has a chop shop and you take it to him and he will, deprogram your car so it doesn't have to meet it looks like it's meeting the emission standards, but it's not. So you go in, you get your test. It looks like it's meeting it, but on the road, of course, you're not. And so we've had a huge uptick in those cases. And, it's fraud. It's just, the kind of thing that we investigate. And let me real quickly, you see this little red sliver. Well, never mind. But anyway, so you see this little red sliver there, Title 18. Title 18 is the federal U.S. code dealing with criminal code. That's what it is. And so you see it's a small percentage, but it involves some of our more important cases. And we can go to the next slide. And so these are some of the federal criminal code statutes that we actually use in our enforcement efforts. So obstruction of justice, that's conspiracy. Two people get together and say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's do fill in the blank. That's a conspiracy. Mail fraud, wire fraud. If you use the internet to further your activities, that's wire fraud. So if I send an email and it's involved in a fraudulent scheme, I've committed wire fraud. Aiding and abetting smuggling. Obviously, we've actually used money laundering quite a bit in a number of cases. False statements is like bread and butter, because we'll go to somebody and say, did you do X? And they say, no, I would never do a thing like that. And of course, they have done that. Well, they've lied to a federal official at that point. And there are many, many instances where, you read in the paper, somebody made a false statement and they can be prosecuted for that. And let's go to the next slide. And the reason why we do that, Title 18 offenses are really important because they do highlight kind of traditional criminal wrongdoing. So if you have a complex environmental case where a jury or a judge may have difficulty understanding some of the complexity, if we can turn and say, well, they also committed mail fraud, to the jury, they committed, perjury, they, whatever the Title 18 offense, that's easier for the jury to understand, the judge to understand, and the assistant United States attorney, because the assistant United States attorney, he or she has a full plate. They're prosecuting, drug crimes and murders and, and any number of sort of the traditional crimes. If we come to them and say, we've got this case where this guy did, and you again fill in the blank, this environmental violation, they may look at you and go, what? Is that really a crime? Because they're not knowledgeable or educated about these statutes. But when I can point out to that assistant United States attorney, they committed mail fraud, they were involved in a conspiracy, then he or she's like, okay, I understand that, and I'm willing to take this case, because we have to sell those cases to the United States, the Department of Justice. And it really, these cases are, as I said up near the top, it's lying, cheating, and stealing. This is what this is about. And one of the, I think, important aspects of this is the expert testimony is less pivotal. You don't have to explain to somebody very much what a conspiracy is, but if I'm trying to explain a complex Clean Air Act violation case, if I have to go to a jury and explain how this intricate software was tinkered with and there was a Clean Air Act violation, that might be difficult for a jury to grasp the complexity and the danger of that. But if it's lying, cheating, and stealing, they understand that. And I don't need an expert to testify about lying, cheating, and stealing. Anybody can get that. And obviously the penalties are more severe. Typical, in the organic statutes, it's be a couple of years maximum penalties if you violate the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the more severe penalties. But the Title 18 offenses can be very severe, 10, 15, 20 years in prison. And those are valuable tools to get cooperation from somebody if they're, saying, well, I'm not going to, cop to this environmental crime. Says, well, we have you on these other Title 18 offenses. Maybe you want to talk. So important point, why do we prosecute environmental crimes? Well, obviously there are statutes that say don't do whatever you are alleged to have done. But it also protects society. And we all know pollution harms people. There's no question about that. Criminal prosecutions obviously deter future violations in two ways. If I go to prison for an environmental crime, I'm not going to be committing that crime for a while. That's specific deterrence. I've been deterred. If I go to prison and everybody hears about it, they may be deterred. That's general deterrence. So the idea is that, you want to deter crime through, effective action. And incarceration can't be passed off. You can't just write a check. No, you're going to prison. And so that is a significant deterrent. Really important here, last two bullets, levels the playing field. There are many honest market participants out there. If somebody is cheating and gaining a significant advantage, that's totally unfair to them. So we want to, and I've had any number of discussions with regulated industries where we've prosecuted their members and they say, thank you, because that person was cheating. They were undermining our ability to, for us to make profit. That's what we want. We want the bad actors to be punished. But more importantly, I think, is especially in the renewable fuels market, this is something the government created, right? The government, Congress, passed the Renewable Fuels Act and they created a market. So the government has an obligation to police that because you can't set up a market and then walk away from it. That's just, and that would be just a wretched approach to, the market itself. But, and also in these kind of emerging markets that we're looking at here today, there aren't well-developed regulatory guardrails yet in some cases. We're still trying to come up with the means to best regulate those emerging markets. And when we have access to some of those Title 18 offenses, so maybe there's not a law that prevents you from doing something in this emerging market, a specific statute, but there might be a Title 18 offense. You might be committing mail fraud or conspiracy, whatever. So these are important tools, going back to this other, but you want to police these markets, including these emerging markets. So let's go to the renewable fuel standards. Many of you may be familiar with this, but the Energy Policy Act 2005, and there have been lots of amendments to it since then, but this is sort of the foundational piece. But basically, it amends the Clean Air Act, and it requires EPA to develop these regulations regarding renewable fuel production in transportation. And obviously, we want to encourage the reduction of the nation's dependence on imported oil. So that was the underlying purpose that Congress passed this. And let's go next one. And so the renewable fuel standards, as you can see, there's two primary obligated parties. There are the refiners and the fuel importers. And they have what's called a renewable volume obligation. So because it's the federal government, we have to have acronyms and abbreviations, but we have an RVO. And as you can see, you have to blend a certain amount of renewable fuel into the fossil fuel supply on a yearly basis. And it's a slowly rising amount. So it started out in 2005. I don't remember the exact number, but started at a very low level. We're getting up to, I want to say, close to 20 billion gallons a year. So it's a stepped increase that's going on here in that. And then it's important, the obligated parties, these refiners and importers, they can meet their renewable obligations by two means, okay? So they can either produce their own renewable fuel, or they can purchase what's called a renewable identification number, a RIN, from a third-party producer. Now, when we talked to I didn't talk to them, the people who set up this regulatory program did, but when they talked to the refiners and the importers, the last thing they wanted to do was have to set up renewable fuel production facilities. That's not what they do. They refine oil into various products, they import fuels. So they were in favor of having this third-party production, and then we would have the system called a renewable identification number, a RIN, which would track it. Now, I will get to that next. And so a RIN, the renewable identification number, it's a 38-character numeric code that's generated by the producer, typically, and it provides information. It's coded. So it tells EPA who produced it, where they produced it, how they produced it, and a lot of other information. So basically, we will know your production process. We will know your feedstock. We will know, the date you produced the fuel, et cetera. And then this is all transacted in an EPA database, and then that database generates the 38-digit code. So we can actually track, a gallon of ethanol or a gallon and a half of biodiesel by looking at that 38-digit number and saying, oh, it was produced in Indiana at this location in April of 2021 using this production process and this feedstock, So all that is embedded in that 38-digit code. It's cumbersome, but it's attached to every unit of renewable fuel. So basically, the renewable fuel standard requirements, as you can see, you have to come register with EPA. If you want to produce renewable fuels and secure the benefit of having a RIN, which you can sell a RIN because obligated parties have to buy these RINs, right? So it's all done in an EPA database. It's called the EPA's Moderated Transaction System. Again, we have to have an acronym and an abbreviation. But basically, you can see there are these requirements, and it's all tracked in the system. So if I'm producing fuel in some state, EPA is keeping a record. I have an identity in the system. They know who I am, and they know what I'm making, and they know what kind of feedstock I'm using and my production numbers, et cetera. So it's all tracked, okay? So we go to the next slide. We have a trading program, right? So obviously, I'm a producer of renewable fuels. I have a registration with EPA. I make my renewable fuels, and then I sell that renewable fuel with the attached RIN to a blender. And the blender then blends it into the, the fuel supply. And then that blender can sell that RIN separately, can detach that RIN and sell it to an obligated party, let's say a refiner. So if the refiner has an obligation, let's say to blend 10 million gallons of renewable fuel, they would just go to the blender and buy 10 million RINs. And the RINs can sell anywhere from a little bit below $1 to above, quite a bit above $1, depending on the RIN. And so basic premise, you can see here, 4 basic issues here. You can't produce, unlawful to produce a renewable fuel and generate a RIN without producing the fuel. So I can't go into the system and say I made 1 million gallons of renewable fuel and didn't do it. That's obviously illegal. That would be fraud. Now, important criticism here that's been leveled at EPA and the government for this, which is that you should make the obligated party the blender because they are the ones who are actually buying the fuel typically. Well, that's kind of a policy call. That's not my call. That's, we're the prosecutorial arm. So what we do is that we look for the guy who has violated the law. But, you can find it on the internet. People have criticized the renewable fuels program as kind of misdirecting who the obligated party is. Again, it's a policy issue. But anyway, I want to point out, so obviously, if you generate an invalid RIN, you can't use it for anything. It's not legally usable. And you can't in any way use them for compliance. Obviously, if I'm an oil company and I purchased 1 million invalid RINs, and then I come to EPA and said, here's I used, I bought 1 million RINs. Well, sorry, those are not valid RINs. We've looked into them and they're invalid. You've been cheated. You need to go out and buy 1 million valid RINs now. So the onus is on the regulated entity to make sure that they've done their due diligence and are purchasing valid RINs. Okay, so let's talk about an actual scheme to defraud. Now, I helped prosecute this case, and it was a complex case, and it wasn't just EPA. We had, I'm trying to remember all the federal agencies involved. The IRS was involved because there's tax credits associated with RINs production. The Marshal Service was involved because of we'll talk about that. The FBI was briefly involved. We had local and state law enforcement involved because this was a fairly substantial fraud. So Phil Rivkin was in Houston area, and he was owner of this company called Green Diesel. And he had well over a dozen other corporate entities or shell companies. And so he had created this maze of corporate structures, which was actually, it took our investigators and the IRS particularly quite a while to untangle who owned what and under what circumstances, because he was claiming to be selling and transferring fuel through these various shell companies, and we had to track all that down. It was quite the effort. And it slowed our investigation until we figured out sort of what was going on. But anyway, registered in Delaware, and he claimed to be a biofuels producer. Now, Rivkin became kind of a minor celebrity in the renewable fuels world because he was sort of seen as kind of almost like a Rumpelstiltskin character. He could take waste oil and things like that, and he could spin it into gold, into money, and people were just really impressed with this guy. So let me explain to you what happened to Mr. Rivkin. So really, this is get into the details, but this is almost a movie-worthy, script kind of story about this guy with the twists and turns. It's fascinating. And remember, we're uncovering this as we go along, and there would be moments where I'd be on the team, the call with the agents, and we'd be like, he did what? Like, are you kidding me? Like, did that really happen? And, I mean, we'd all be shocked by it, but this is the way it works. So anyway, Rivkin purchased a modular renewable fuels production plant from India to manufacture biodiesel from soybean oil. Now, I find this interesting. You can actually, there's an entire separate industry now associated with the renewable fuels program, guys who manufacture production plants and engineering firms that are set up to help you get the plant up and running and, to meet all the specs, the ASTM specs for, acceptable biodiesel. So this program has spun off all this other, economic activity, not just the fuels, but all the associated stuff that has to happen to meet the specs and to be compliant. So it's quite the, a government program that creates an awful lot of economic activity. Anyway, he buys this plant, invests millions of dollars in it, and he couldn't get the plant to work properly. It wouldn't produce on-spec biodiesel. And he hired engineering firms, and they were coming in and trying to work with the plant and rejigger it. And finally, they told him, it's going to cost you tens of millions of dollars to get this plant to work properly. And Rivkin is, of course, quite unhappy about this. So in his defense, he was trying to set up a working biodiesel plant, but made mistakes. It wasn't working. So Rivkin decided, I'll just turn to crime to get my money back and to make money. So the point I want to make about that is that if your business model requires you to commit fraud, you might want to reconsider your business model. That's probably not the best way forward. You may get away with it for a while, but people get defrauded. The government finds out, there are consequences. It's just not the way forward. Anyway, so let's go to the next. So basically, he sold over 60 million fraudulent RINs to various brokers, major oil companies. Obviously, these RINs get resold because there's a secondary market in RINs. Because if I'm an astute trader, because there are actually folks who have nothing but a telephone and a computer, and they're tracking the RINs market. And when they see some kind of a shift in the cost that they can take advantage of, they will snap up RINs and then flip them to somebody else who needs them. One of the things we learned from talking to some of the traders is that when you see an unusually cheap RIN, your radar should be up, that there's something not right there. But since the trader doesn't get in trouble for flipping a bad RIN, it's the person who produced it, there's no kind of market incentive to keep the traders from flipping the bad RINs. Again, an issue that Congress would need to adjust. But anyway, so Rivkin discovered that making false RINs was just lucrative. I mean, he became the second largest biofuels producer in the US without producing one drop of biofuel. Now, what he was doing was he would go into our database. He had an identity. He had registered his production method. He had registered his feedstock. He had registered all the requisite things that we required. He had set up a plant on the Houston Ship Channel. So he had access to cheap transport of feedstock in. He had storage facilities nearby. Everything looked legitimate on paper. It was all good to go. But he couldn't get the plant to work. So he just starts entering false numbers into the database. Says, last month I produced 1 million gallons of biodiesel. So we, okay, great. We know what your production process is. We know who you are. We know where you're located. Here's 1 million RINs, Mr. Rivkin. And so month after month, he discovered, gee, I can get rich. And he just began entering more and more fake numbers into the system. Well, eventually, when he became extremely large, EPA goes, wow, we need to go down and take a look at this guy who's like the second largest biofuels producer in America. And when they get there, they inspect the facility, and what they find is a non-functional plant. The thing was actually rusting. It obviously hadn't been run in years. And there were like 2 or 3 guys hanging around, tinkering with the equipment, but there was clearly no production facility here producing millions of gallons of biofuel, monthly. Now, Rivkin obviously realizes this is not good. So he gets ready, he's going to flee the country. Now, he's an extremely wealthy guy at this point, right? So first thing he does is, this is part of the movie script stuff. He calls the Houston Police Department and he says, home invaders invaded my home, held my wife and I at gunpoint, stole all of our jewelry, our gold that we had stored in the safe, potentially millions of dollars of stuff was stolen from our home. They stole my Bentley, I think it was a Bentley, and they stole my Bentley and they drove off. And so, a couple hours later, the police find the Bentley, 8 or 10 blocks down the road, no evidence of any people around. And as the local police who we worked with, looking more and more into this, they're like, we're not convinced there was a home invasion here. So, why would you do that? Well, you're about to abscond with millions of dollars in jewelry and gold. So, it was stolen. Maybe, I don't know if he filed an insurance claim on it or not, but nevertheless, suddenly millions of dollars has evaporated, but, in a theft, but maybe not. And we could never prove that it was a falsified home invasion anyway. So Rivkin flees to Spain. And remember, he's kind of a well-known guy in the renewable fuel, so people are flocking to him. They want to do deals with Rivkin because, he's the guy who's made a fortune in America doing renewable fuels. He's hosting lavish parties in Spain and in Switzerland, drawing investors in, into his newest European scheme. And we haven't indicted him at this point. We're investigating him. We're trying to figure out what happened here. But we were far enough along that when he had his art collection boxed up, crated up, and ready to ship to Europe, we, in a last-minute warrant, intercepted it on a dock in New Jersey. So there was this huge container filled with his private art collection, $16 million art collection. It was like paintings, famous photographs, like from, what's his name? Who's the Ansel Adams, other people, like original artwork, all kinds of stuff. $16 million, we scooped it up on the dock in New Jersey. He was very upset with us. He was furious. One of the other things that Mr. Rivkin had failed to think through is he had defrauded some equity group down in Houston out of about $3 or $4 million in false RINs. And they were not happy. So they went and got a court order to seize any of his properties that were here in the United States. Now, we had seized a lot of his automobiles and the artwork and some of the real estate, so the federal government obviously, first claim. But a very clever attorney, and I want to say, don't quote me on this, I want to say his name was Fetterman, not the guy running for Senate, but some attorney down in Texas named Fetterman. And he gets that app that tracks airplanes because Rivkin has a private jet. And he locates the jet in Panama. And so I wish I was making this up because it's just so strange. He gets a couple of pilots and a couple of mechanics, and they fly down to Panama. And they find the jet on this airport. And so he's got a court order saying you can, seize Mr. Rivkin's property because he, defrauded you. Now, that was in the United States. I'm not sure exactly how it works in Panama. But anyway, there's planes blocking the runway stuff. So the mechanics go out to some of the other Panamanian mechanics there on the runway, and they bet them. They didn't bribe them. They bet them. I'll bet you $100 you can't move that plane in 5 minutes. And so they place a number of bets with some of the local mechanics at the airport. And sure enough, those planes clear the runway because, well, they haven't bribed anybody, right? They placed a bet. And now the runway's open. So they jump in the plane and they take off. The tower's yelling at them, "What the hell are you doing? You're not authorized to take off." And they take the plane and they fly it back to Houston. So they stole Rivkin's plane. Again, he's furious, but now we know he's somewhere in Central America. Okay, so we eventually get some tips and we locate him, I want to say it was in Guatemala, and this has not been years. We locate him in Guatemala and he's changed his name. He actually got adult adopted. So he found somebody down there to adopt him, and he's no longer Philip Rivkin, he's now Felipe Arriaga. But we, obviously I said there are many federal agencies involved in this at this point. And so the Guatemalan government expels Mr. Rivkin for this fraudulent adult adoption scheme. And so he gets on an airplane to Houston with an immediate transfer to somewhere in the Caribbean. But unknown to Mr. Rivkin, there were quite a few US Marshals on the plane with him. So when he deplaned, he was met by a greeting committee and he's now in federal custody. So as I said, there are many charges that we could have brought against him, money laundering, all kinds of things. I think to move the case along in DOJ, we've caught him, we want to move on. So he eventually pled guilty to wire fraud, mail fraud, I'm sorry, and a Clean Air Act violation, because the underlying basis for the entire crime was fraud on the renewable fuels market. So he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. We estimate there was over $100 million in various renewable fuel credits and tax credits that were involved in the fraud. Now, we recovered some of that. Now, an interesting side note on this, some of the victims of his fraud were included big oil companies, Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron. And there's something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act. So if you're a crime victim, you may be eligible for compensation, especially if there is some monetary, something of monetary value that we have secured from the perpetrator. So there's an office within the federal government that, in the DOJ that actually takes care of all that. So we had them approach the oil companies, the big oils, who had lost millions in fraud to Mr. Rivkin. And we said, hey, we've got some of his assets, and if you can prove up to us what you lost, we'll compensate you. And we got a complete crickets from the oil companies. And I was like, what the heck? Why wouldn't you care about lost millions of dollars? And and I thought, well, maybe it's a rounding error. They don't care. Or maybe they can find that in the couch cushions at Exxon headquarters, or maybe they just don't want to talk to us about how they buy and sell RINs. And it would be better that they just not engage with us. So I don't know the answer to that, but I thought it was just fascinating that when we try to, some of the people who like the smaller traders and people like that, or some of the equity investors were happy to get some money back, but for some reason the oil companies just didn't care. But anyway, Mr. Rivkin is still a guest of the federal government, and will be for just a while yet. But the key point I'm trying to make is that the government sets up a market. It's really important for the government to police that market. And Mr. Rivkin is not the only fellow who's done this. There have been plenty of examples. You can look it up on the internet. And there might be some who slip through the cracks. I won't deny that. But eventually, what happens is that people tend not to say, "Gee, I made $1 million or I made $2 million, and now I'm satisfied and I'm going away." No, well, if I can make 2, I can make 10. And pretty soon things fall apart for them. So the key here is that it really is important to have an oversight of these markets, and that to have a mechanism to punish the people who are defrauding the market. And that's really what we're doing here. And I'm happy to take questions or.
Yeah, I have one here, and then I have my own, and we'll see if anything else comes in. Thank you very, very much for that. I think the most interesting from a storytelling perspective presentation today, hands down. Kind of in reference to the third thesis that you were alluding to of why there might have been crickets when like an oil major could have an easy path to recovery.
would be similar to yours, that I think that it would make sense that they just wouldn't really want any scrutiny in that space, because I would imagine there's a lot of rounding errors if you wanted to put it nicely. My question is, like, with clearly this person maxed out, maxed the system out.
Mhm.
It seems like if this could have been done for this many years, I remember when we had one of our preparatory conversations talking about, stretch thin resources at the
Mhm.
federal level and so on and so forth. So would a savvier operator, whether it's like a private or a big public, would there be really, it sounds to me like there'd be relatively easy ways to do something like this on an incremental level. And let's say you have like supply issues with your feedstock for a week, you could kind of fudge that 1 week. And as long as you're doing everything else, the 11 months and 3 weeks out of the year, correct, it would be kind of difficult to discern. Is that the
I
case
think
or
that's
not?
conceivable. I mean, limited resources actually lend themselves to that kind of subterfuge, right? I mean, I can't look into every single potential, gee, what's going on over there, if it's small scale. So potentially, sure, but there's also, as we've discovered, when you have, for example, disgruntled employees, you have somebody who, the company went under and the person who lost their job is thinking, hey, what happened here? And they're the kinds of tips we get about, hey, you should look into what they're doing. In fact, one of the really big cases we had, and it was an Indiana ethanol, I think it was an ethanol biofuels producer. They had basically they weren't really producing on-spec biodiesel, but were saying they were. But one of the people who was using their biodiesel, it fouled their engine so badly on their vehicle that they started looking into it on their own, and then outed these guys who were producing off-spec but claiming it was on-spec. And there's all kinds of, we've tried to put safeguards in. So for example, some years ago, we made some amendments to the regulations that everything you do has to be audited by a third party. So you have to get a third party engineering firm or auditing firm to come in and look at your feedstock. If you're saying that I have 100 pounds of feedstock that, will produce, 100 gallons of biodiesel, the auditor should be looking at that. Now, we just finished prosecuting a case last year, I think 2 years ago, where one of the major biodiesel producers was simply bribing the auditor.
Oh, nice.
Okay, but that all got caught. And so, the auditors and, facing prison, the biodiesel producers already, some of them are in prison. So yeah, there might be ways to fudge the market on a limited scale, but people tend to not limit themselves to,
Being limited.
yeah, to being limited, right?
That's consistent with my understanding of greed.
Yeah, great, that's great.
Yeah. And then the question from the audience, there's a shift on a macro level, obviously, to more and more renewable fuels. I know HF Sinclair, a large part of that merger with Holly Frontier and Sinclair was about the renewable fuels capacity in the West Coast. I can't remember which major. Chevron, is what my memory is telling me, is opening up a new refinery that is specializing in renewable fuel production. Is there talk amongst your personnel, obviously to the extent that you'd be able to disclose, but about, like, I mean, if you're already stretched thin, you're about to be thinner, because I mean, there's the volumes are going to continue to get ramped. Whether it's a low carbon fuel credit in California, there's many state regimes coming out to try to supplement the federal regime. What does that look like in those marble halls in DC? Like,
Well, obviously resource constraints are really a problem. We're hopeful that, our budget's going to give us some more people here soon. At one point we had, 10% or so of all of our folks dedicated to like looking into, I think 10% is the number that sticks in my head. Don't quote me on that, but of just doing renewable fuels criminal investigations because it had become so rampant. But it's fallen off since then too. But, it also requires Congress or, to step in and say, okay, here's some amendments that we think will fix some of the problems. And as you talked about the state programs, those are important partners to us. I mean, we will work with the state programs that leverages everybody's resources, and we can give them the benefit of what we have learned, in the years that we've been regulating and enforcing this, to kind of give them a heads up. These are the kinds of things you should be looking for.
do you use ethanol in your personal driving?
Yeah, I think I might.
You have an ethanol mix E15?
No, I don't have 15. My car, my 26-year-old vehicle won't tolerate it. But in fact, that's the new car is 10 years old, so, they won't tolerate that.
So you got renewable fuels as a focus for investigation. Any other sectors that sort of have a decent amount of fraud that investigative journalism companies should be spending their time on?
Well, I mean, as Daniel knows, one of my moments of anguish there at EPA is that, in the fracking industry, you take the return flow and the produced water, and sometimes I think they're doing it in the Appalachian Basin, they process that return flow and produced water to use it for additional fracking. But that stuff may contain radioactivity. Now, it has been my personal contention, which I'm still trying to discuss with my colleagues, that if someone processes the return or produced flow to get some water for more fracking, but the waste product from that is an industrial waste. And much of the return flow produced water that's, that waste product from that waste treatment system, that's stuck down class 2 wells. And my objection to that is, I don't think that's an oil and gas product that's naturally occurring from production of oil and gas, which is what those class 2 disposal wells are intended for, but rather this is now it's a waste treatment system product. And in some instances, I don't know this, I've read about this a little bit, that some of the richer pockets of gas, especially in the Marcellus Shale, are also some of the more radioactive. So the produced water and the return flow will have a higher level of alpha radiation. And so if you're concentrating that into an industrial waste and then sticking it down a class 2 well, I have some concerns about that. But that's an interpretive issue, right? That the program offices would have to agree that's something that merits looking into.
We've written about that before. I have no idea what planted that seed in my head, but yeah, no, it's a fascinating issue for sure. JT, as always,
All right.
I really am so thankful and appreciative, and this was a total delight.
All right,
Very
thanks.
much.
It was great.